I'm a Poet has to be one of my favourite episodes of Arthur so far. I had no recollection of this episode from when I was a child, but I watched it now for what I assume is the first time, and I actually really rather enjoyed it. This is the first segment in the 28th episode of the first season of Arthur. 28 episodes, that's rather a lot. And there is a poetry competition coming up that Mr. Ratburn explains to the class, and the quiet character Fern is busy writing poetry, and the tough customers are making fun of her, and she stands up and challenges everybody to write a poem for the competition. And it's the first time, as the other characters recognise, that she's really spoken, that she's really stood up for herself, and I love that. I love the fact that she's a quiet, reserved character, but when it comes to something she's passionate about and something she believes in, she speaks up, and I think that's such an admirable quality. As somebody who grew up being very quiet and very reserved, this is the kind of influence I could have benefited from. And everybody does. Everybody accepts the fact that they made fun of poetry, but they now need to prove that they can write poems, and we get to hear them putting together some clunky poems, some actually very well crafted poems that I thought were rather delightful. And they get to read the poems out, and the Brains poem about rain, I really enjoyed. It was very effective. And what I particularly loved, without spoiling too much, is when Binky read out his poem. The poem wasn't great, but Fern was so enthusiastic in praising him for it. And I love the fact that she was offering encouragement and being this source of positivity when it comes to poetry, and championing the fact that it doesn't matter what your poem is like. It's the fact that you wrote a poem. And I think that that's such a brilliant, positive attitude, and she's such a fabulous character. What's also interesting is that we actually have a genuine poet reading his own poems. I was unaware of the work of Jack Prelutsky, but I have done some Googling after watching it, and he voices the character himself and reads some of his own poems, which of course is a lot of fun and obviously educational for me because I wasn't aware of his work. I'd be interested to know if you were aware of his work and you watched this as a child, and kind of how you felt that connection. I imagine the equivalent in the UK would be maybe Michael Rosen. If Michael Rosen were to voice his own character, I think that would be pretty awesome. But I loved it. As a poetry fan, I really adored this episode. Fern is a brilliant character. I have to say, it's one of my favourites. What I will say though is Arthur's poem was a bit rubbish. And I won't say why or what it's like, but it just seemed to come out of nowhere. And it didn't really seem to work. And I just didn't really understand the point of Arthur's poem. Not that I should, do an anti-Fern and say that it shouldn't have been written, because credit to him for writing it, but it didn't make a lot of sense to me where he would have got those ideas or how that poem would have become formed. It didn't work, but everything else I thought was beautiful and an absolute delight. If you haven't seen I'm a Poet and you're a fan of Arthur, and in particular if you're a fan of poetry, needless to say, I think it's one you'll love.